Hello and welcome back. In this video what I'm going to be doing is building a rig that we can use to animate our robot. And we're going to be using the constraints that I showed in the last video to do so. We got to keep a few things in mind while we do this. One of those things would be if this object is intended to go into a video game, we want to combine as many objects as we can to minimize the number of draw calls on the engine. We also want to make sure we get all of our pivot locations set very carefully. And then we want to limit as much control so that the animator doesn't accidentally break the model in the animation process, and that selection process of the handles is very easy. So what I'm going to do to start with, I'm going to zoom in here on the head of this object. And you can see I've got these little clamps and then the pen that rotates. These don't necessarily need to be separate objects, so I'm going to select them both at the same time, and then I'm going to go up to Mesh, so switch to my modeling toolset, Mesh, and Combine. Another way I could find that menu is once these are selected, I could hold Shift and right mouse, and Combine is in that list as well. So then I'll select the next one and I'll run a Combine. And then I need to make sure that these get renamed, as well as the construction history that was created by this combination is deleted. So I'll select them both. Alt-Shift-D is the shortcut to delete construction history. And then I'm going to rename these. So I'll call this first one Clamp 1, and I'll call this other one Clamp 2. Okay, so then I've got this object here and the clamp mount that is facilitated with it. So I'm going to go ahead and run a combine on those. Make sure I get rid of the construction history. And I'm going to name this to be my clamp mount. As I go down, this pen and this arm can be combined. So I'll make sure I select those, run a combine, get rid of the object history on them, keep the naming conventions. So lastly, these objects are fine as they are. So the base is going to be translating the object around. The base mount here is going to be rotating the y-axis of this robot, and then each arm and clamp will rotate around their respective pen. Okay, so now that I've got those all kind of combined and their names cleaned up, we need to make sure we get the pivot locations for each of these objects set. I'm going to go ahead and just look at this from the side view. Hit W so I can see my translation handle. And it's basically dead center in the middle. Now, this would actually be better if this was placed onto the ground. And the reason for that is that way when I set this to 0, I'm actually on the ground, not partially in the ground or something else. So I'm going to set this pivot point right at the ground value. I'm going to move up, select the next object, Control 1 to isolate it, D to unlock the pivot, and then I'll snap this to the lowest vertice that belongs to this object, D to lock the pivot, Control 1, I can bring my objects back. Now this one we've got a kind of interesting thing going on here. You can see these curved lines, and that's because I have this object in smooth preview. And if I move the pivot right now, snap it to where the center of this radius is, and then I press the 1 key, take it out of smooth preview, you're going to notice that these do not actually align anymore. And that's just something you need to be aware of if you're in smooth preview, that you be careful to check for. So I'm going to take it out of smooth preview, set the pivot to the center of the radius, and for now I'll just leave it out of smooth preview. I'm going to move up, I'm going to grab the next piece, and we got the same thing kind of going on here. The only difference is I actually have a pen I could snap to, so I'm going to just leave it as is, snap to the center of the pen, like so, and just keep moving up the chain so that I don't get the wrong piece selected here. I'm going to jump to my perspective view and then unlock this pivot, set it where I need it to be. The collar up here at the top needs to rotate around Y, so having it set to the center where it's at is perfectly fine. And then each of these clamps needs to rotate around the pivot. So I'm going to come to my front view and I'll snap this pivot location to the center of those pins and then lock them down. Okay. And we can double check if we want to that these all work exactly the way we expect them to, which is a good rule of thumb after you've done this. Before you actually start the constraining process, double check that you've got all your pivot locations set up correctly, that you don't have any transforms, and all your object history has been deleted, because that's going to be a problem when you come back. All right, so now that that is done, I'm going to go ahead and select all of these pieces, except for the ground plane here, and then group them. And just call this my robot group. And then I can take this group and I can put it on a display layer. If I look in the channel box at the very bottom, we have a display tab. And I have a group selected right now. So I'm going to click the button on the far right, and that will add the selected group to this new layer. Then I'll name this layer my robot display layer. And I can't have any spaces or anything in this. So there we go. And what that allows me to do is quickly show hide this, and or I can check it to reference and template if I would like, and that makes it not selectable out here in the scene, which is how I'm able to drag select and not get my ground plane. And that's just a very convenient way of working with these. So now that we've got that, we're going to go ahead and start setting up the chain of NURBs handles for the animation rig. And so we're going to make sure we're in the curved surface menu up here at the top, and just create a NURBS circle. I'm going to start by just scaling it up, make it big enough that I can see it. And then I'm going to change the shape so that it represents a translation shape. So I'm going to select every other control vertex. I did that by holding my right mouse and going to control vertex. Then I'm just going to scale these points in so that I get something of an arrow shape here. I would like this handles pivot to stay at the ground where the object's pivot location is. But it would also be nice if the handle shape was not on the ground. And I can do this two different ways. I could just object select the handle, move it up where I would like it, and then move the pivot back down. But the pivot currently is exactly where I need it. So if I translate this by using the control verts instead, if I select all of them, these can be moved, put this someplace selectable, but the object's pivot location has still stayed at the ground value. Alright, so then I'm going to go ahead and make sure that there is no transform and construction history on this. So modify, freeze transform. I have mine set up with a hotkey. If you'd like to do that, you can do that in Windows and then go to Settings Preferences, Hotkey Editor. Give yourself a hotkey for freeze transforms. Modify, freeze transforms. That's going to set this pivot, or excuse me, this object space to 0 and a scale of 1. You can see that I have construction history. You can find that under Edit, Delete by Type, and we have a shortcut of Alt-Shift-D. So that's what I'm going to be using from here on out. Now we don't have any construction history. The transforms have been frozen. We want to also make sure we name this handle. So I'm going to call this the base translate handle. And then I'm going to continue my way up. So I'm going to make another circle. And I would like this circle to pivot from the bottom of this rotation object. So I'm going to go ahead and isolate those. Snap this to the bottom. And then scale it up so I can see it. Similar to the other translation handle, I want to make sure I can grab this easily, but I would like its pivot to stay there. So I'm going to right mouse hold into control verts, grab them all. Put the handle someplace that's easier to grab, and then you can see that its pivot stayed behind. So we'll clean this up by freezing the transforms, deleting the construction history, and then we'll name this the base rotation handle. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is set up the rotation handles for these arms. So I'm going to use another NURB circle. I'm going to go ahead and bring it up where I can see it and scale it so it's a little bit bigger. I'm going to look at this from my side view, and I want to make sure that I have this pivot location lined with that lower arm. And then it would also make sense if this was facing the other direction. Since this arm rotates this way, it would make sense that the handle shape was that direction. Go ahead and set this to just an even number. grab its control verts, and then I'm going to drag it out away where it's easier to grab onto, like so. Freeze the transforms, delete the construction history, and then this one I will name lower arm handle. Now more or less this is set up the way I need for up here. So I'm going to just duplicate it. Then I'll take the duplicate handle, we'll move it up. Make sure it aligns with that pen location. And then since my robot kind of has a taper, I might take these control verts and just have them taper a little bit. I'll scale them down slightly. Once I get that set where I would like it, we're going to go ahead and freeze the transforms, delete any construction history, and then I'll name this to upper arm handle. We'll duplicate it. We'll move this duplicate up where we've got this clamp mount. This is the clamp mount. So we'll focus in, set the pivot location, and then out in space I'll grab the control verts and I'll scale them down a little bit so that I've got a little bit of a taper going on to my rig. Freeze the transforms, get rid of any object history, and name this. And this will be my clamp mount handle. So now I've got this piece here that we need a handle for. And it's going to rotate around its Y. So basically all I really need is a circle that lines up with the center. So I'm going to use the pen location here to snap to. And then I'll scale this up as well so that we can grab onto it outside of the robot, like so. Once I get this positioned, we're going to freeze the transforms, delete the history, and name it. So this is going to be the clamp collar handle. And then I only need two more, one for each of these little clamps. So I'll make another circle. I'm going to bring it up here and then look at it through my front view. I'll snap its location to where the center of the pen is. Then I'm going to rotate this over by 90 degrees in X so that it's facing the direction of the rotation. And I'll scale it up a little bit. When I have this one done, I can go ahead and freeze its transforms, delete its history, and then duplicate it. And I'll use the duplicate for the other side, like so. And then I'll make sure I freeze the transforms on it as well. And we'll name these to, we'll have it be clamp 01 handle and clamp 02 handle. Okay. So if we're ever worried that we missed any of the transforms or the construction history, we can go back, we can quick select everything, we can do one last freeze and one last delete of history, and we should just make sure that they are all clean before we move on, because once we have the constraints done, this process is not easy to go back and clean up. I'm going to go ahead and hide my robot for a second. We need all of these handles to work in a chain similar to how we set it up in the last video. The easiest way to think about this is if this handle down here were to move around, everything above it would need to follow. If this handle here were to rotate, everything above it would need to follow, etc., etc. So I'm just going to drag select all the handles above the base translation, and then in my outliner, middle mouse drag those handles into the base translation handle. And that has created a simple object-based parent. So if I have the translation handle selected, I can move everything around. So we're going to take everything above this base rotation handle and we'll parent it. We'll take everything above the lower arm handle and parent it. Everything above the upper arm handle and parent it. Then we've got this clamp mount handle. So we want the collar and the two clamp controls inside the clamp mount. And then lastly, these two clamps need to move wherever the clamp collar handle moves, but then that's the end of the chain. These do not control each other. They're completely independent, and they're also the end of this object chain. And so now what I have is the ability to grab any one of these, and I could rotate, and you'll notice that the other objects follow along. Very good. So at this point, what we can do is we can start adding the constraints back to our object. I'm going to go ahead and take my base translation handle, and we'll stick it on a visibility layer as well. I'll name this my maybe my anim handle display layer. Go ahead and save that, and that way if I ever want to show hide this, I can. And I can also make it non-selectable if I choose. So display layers are extremely useful. And what we're trying to do here is create two nice clean groups that have control of each other if they need to be, but they also can have selection independently when we want them to. And that's why we're setting it up this way. So now we're going to need to get to our constrain menu, and we're only going to use parenting constraints for this. So I need to switch from my modeling toolset up here to my rigging toolset, and then go into the constrain menu. And I need parenting for this. I'm going to go ahead and just temporarily tear this off. We want to select the object of control and then the child. So I have the base translation handle selected. Then I'll select the base translation object. I'm going to go to the parenting constraint and open the options. Make sure that I am maintaining offset. Make sure that I have translation as well as rotation selected. And then go ahead and say add. And now that I've checked my options and ran the tool, every time I run it from this point forward, it's going to use the exact same setup. So I don't need to check the options again. So now what I can do is I can just quickly move up the chain. I'll select the rotation handle and the rotation object and parent. The lower arm handle, the lower arm object and parent. Upper arm handle, upper arm object, parent. I'll grab the clamp mount handle and the clamp mount object, parent, and then I'll come up and grab the clamp collar handle and the clamp collar object, parent. Lastly, I'll grab clamp 1 handle and clamp 1 object, parent, and clamp 2 handle, clamp 2 object, and parent. You'll notice that whenever we do that, we're getting these keys, like I said in the last video. I don't need this constraint menu anymore, so I'm going to close it. Then I want to double check that these are actually working. So now I can rotate this handle and it rotates the object. If I rotate this collar, all the objects follow along, and we just want to double check that everything is moving the way we would like it to. And so far it is, which is great. Okay, now at this point, I don't really need to be able to ever select my robot object again. And I could do that simply by checking its display layer to reference. I'm going to go ahead and put my lower arm and upper arm back in smooth preview just so they look a little nicer. Then I'm going to find my robot display layer and check the third box until I see an R. And now when I drag select, all I ever get is handles, which makes animating this quite a bit easier because I don't actually accidentally select any of these other objects. I only get the handles that I want to work with. Okay, so we're getting there. We still have a couple problems. This handle, yes, it rotates my upper arm where I would like it to, but it also rotates it all the way around and through things, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I still have the ability to translate it and or to scale it, and by doing so I physically break my model apart. And we don't want the animator to accidentally break the model apart. So we want to make sure we limit out the controls to each of these. So for example, this first object, this first handle, I only want it to be translating my object around. I don't want it to be scaling it, and I don't want it to be rotating it. So I'm going to come to the channel box and select my rotations and my scales, and then I will right click and say lock and hide. And now those channels are not even available in the channel box. And you'll notice out here, if I'm in scale mode, my scale is grayed out. If I am in rotation mode, my rotation is grayed out. But if I am in translation mode, my translation still works. We're going to do the same thing as we move up. If you ever need to get a channel back, the way you can do that is Windows, General Editor, and then you need to find the channel control and open that up. You'll see a list of available channels that can be in your channel box. And what I removed was rotation and scale. So if we come down in alphabetical order and we find rotate X, Y, and Z, there they are. And then I would move them over to the keyable side of the graph, and then they'd still be locked, but I could select them and then right click and say unlock selected. And that's just a way you can get channels back if you accidentally removed them. This handle here, I only need rotating on Y. So I'm going to go ahead and lock out everything except for rotate Y. This handle, I only need rotating on X, as well as this handle and this handle. So I'm going to go ahead and select all three at once, uncheck rotate X, and lock and hide. And you'll notice that I was able to do all the channels at the same time. The clamp collar up here, I only want rotating on Y. So I'm going to lock out everything else. And then lastly, the clamp handles themselves. This is going to be rotation on the Z. Let me focus back in on that. And so we're going to go ahead and select them both at the same time. And then we'll lock out everything except for rotate Z. Okay. Now we can take this even a step farther. I have this lower arm handle, and if I start to rotate this and I kind of zoom in, you're going to see that at a certain point my model basically collides with itself. It's about 90 degrees I get a collision, and anything past 90 degrees wouldn't make any sense. The robot's actually cutting through itself. And so what we can do here is we can actually set up limitations for these rotations. So I have this handle selected. I'm going to go into the attribute editor, and in the, let's see here, under the lower arm handle node, you're going to see we have a limit information tab. And this is currently rotating on X. So the only one I would care about would be my X. I'm going to go ahead and check on both minimum and maximum and set its minimum to -90. I'll set its maximum to 90, and I'll leave the current value at 0. And what that has done is allow me to lock this so it never goes past the 90-degree angle, which means the animator can't put this into a position that would not make sense. I'm going to do the same thing up here with this handle. Go ahead and start rotating it until I feel like we get a collision issue, which right there we're starting to. And we're going to have a rotation value of about 100 degrees. So I'll go ahead and set the current back to 0, turn on min and max, and I'll set this to -100 and +100. And again, this will be different based on how you have created your object. Lastly, well, not lastly, but next I'm going to take this handle up here that rotates this clamp mount and rotate around until I see a collision issue, which starts to happen right about 92+ degrees. I'm going to go ahead and just leave it at 90. So I'll set my minimum to -90, my current to 0, my maximum to +90. Now, as far as the base rotation and this clamp mount rotation up here, they could just keep going around in circles for all I care, so I'm not going to limit those. But the clamps themselves at a certain point don't really need to open. I don't really think I need these to open more than, say, maybe 90 degrees would be the most I ever needed them to open. So I'll come to their rotate Z, and I'll set up a minimum of -90 and a maximum of 90. Do that for the other handle as well. Okay, great. So I have all the channels I don't want to use at all locked. I have the channels I do want to use limited so that they can't be overused. And then there's only one last thing as far as this rig's concerned that I'd really like to address, and that's this clamp at the top. I could grab each of these independently and animate them open, but it would be nice if I could just control the open and close of this with one control, and we can do that. We can do that with something called a set-driven key. A set-driven key needs to be on an object. So the best place in this situation would be somewhere near the top. I could make a special handle for it, or I could just simply use this handle right here if I would choose. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use this handle I've got for the clamp collar at the top. I'm going to select that. And the way that this works is we create an attribute that controls the things. And then we go back and we key the control of the actual objects. So I first need an attribute that we can control. So in my attribute editor, I will go to the attributes tab at the top and say add attribute. And this opens a little window. It lets me give it a name. So I'll call this my clamp control. And this name needs to be code friendly. So either camel case or dashes, but no special characters, no spaces. Then if you go ahead and you say override nice name, you can put in a name that you would actually like to see in your channel box. This is defaulting to a float variable type. And rotation of these objects is a decimal point number. So float variable type is the kind that we want to use, excuse me. And then we have a minimum and a maximum value. Now I could set these numbers to anything I want. I could set it to 0 and 1 and have 0 and 1 open between 0 and 90 degrees. If I wanted the scale to be linear, I could set the minimum to 0 and the maximum to 90, in which case if I set these to 45, I know I'm at 45 degrees, etc. So what I'm going to do is give it a minimum of 0, a maximum of 90, and tell it its default value is 0, and then just go ahead and add this. What that does is when I have that handle selected and I look in the channel box, you will see that we actually have a new channel, clamp control. And it has a value, if I middle mouse slide, of 0 to 90, and then it stops when it gets to 90. Now it's not actually controlling anything yet, we've just created the channel. So in order to get the set driven key set up, I'm going to go and switch out of rigging into animation. And then once I'm in the animation toolset, we're going to have a menu that says key. I'm going to go ahead and open that, and then we're going to drop down until we see set driven key, and then go over to set. And this opens a dialog box. The top is asking for a driver. The bottom is asking for a driven. Now the object that has the control is the driver. So I select the control object and then come down and say load driver, and you'll see it pop up. The objects that we want to control are the driven. And what I want to do is I want to use this clamp control value to control the rotation of these two smaller clamp handles. So I'll select them both and then say load driven. And now what we have in this dialog box is clamp collar handle and all of its available channels. And then if I select either one of these clamp 1 handles, we'll see their available channels. And we want to make sure we have the object selected and the channel that we're trying to use as control. Then what matters is the value. Now my range is 0 to 90. So I need a key when the clamp is at 0, and I need a key when the clamp is at 90. So I currently am at 0, so we're going to leave it there. I'm going to pick clamp handle 1 and its rotate Z value. They're both currently set to 0 as well. They're in their default position. So with these selected, we're going to go ahead and say key. And what we've done is we've keyed the control to say that when clamp control is at 0, so is the rotation value of this clamp 1 handle. Then I'm going to switch it to clamp 2 handle, rotate Z, and go ahead and key that as well. Notice we see a little key up here at the top. Then I'm going to go back and select my collar handle that has the control by just selecting it right here in the driver. I'm going to set the clamp control up to its maximum value of 90. And then clamp 2 needs to be open to a positive value of 90. So once I have that set, I'm going to go ahead and key it. Clamp 1, on the other hand, is rotating the opposite direction. So we're going to set this one to negative 90 and then go ahead and key that. Now if this has worked correctly, when we go back to our clamp control, we should be able to open and close these at the same time by moving the clamp control. Now there's still one problem. This is not truly linear at this point because when we key something in Maya, the default graph is slow in, slow out. And what that means at the beginning of this clamp control, when it's closed, it starts to open slow. It translates its movement quicker in the middle, and then it moves down slower. So for example, if I were to set this to 5 degrees, it's not actually 5 degrees. If I were to set it to 30, it's not actually 30 degrees. So what we need to do is edit the graph for the two keyed objects. And the objects that got the key are these two little handles. So I'm going to go ahead and select both of those. Then I'm going to go to Windows, Animation Editor, Graph Editor, and open up my animation graph. You will notice that it is a slow in, slow out curve. And what we want is both rotate z's here to have a linear path. And I can set that by coming up here to the top where we've got these options and finding the one that's a 45-degree angle downward and clicking it. And now this is exact linear scale of 0 to 90. And what that means is if I set this to 45, it is actually 45. If I set it to 20, it's actually 20, and so forth. And so now we have animated we have created a rig so that we can animate our robot. We have these in two separate groups, so I can show hide my handles if I'd like. I can show hide my robot if I would like. I can lock the robot out so that it can't be selected and only the handles can. And I can go ahead and position this in space, and I could rotate. I can continue up the chain and set these however I would like them. We have all of our limits locked down. Etc., etc. Okay, so this is working great. The next thing I'm going to do is talk about actually animating this thing to pick up and set down an object, and we're going to go ahead and do that in the next film.